This online lesson on William Shakespeare's Macbeth will concentrate on Act 1, scenes 4 to 7, in which the following points are important. 1. The soliloquies through which we understand the soliloquies of both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, through which we understand their nature. Secondly, the dramatic irony in the soliloquies, in which they say something and mean something entirely different. 3. The nature of equivocation of the witches, through which the dreams of Macbeth and the temptations of Macbeth are brought into conflict. And 4. The nature or the relationship between the macrocosm and the microcosm, and how the actions of the king affect the common people. Scene 4 begins in the palace of Duncan, where Duncan, Malcolm, Donalbain enter, where they are discussing the execution committed on the Thane of Cawdor. It is important that the killing of a rebel is here termed as execution or murder, which is to say that the rebellion makes the citizen of, or the serving Thane of Duncan's kingdom into someone who does not belong to that kingdom anymore. He is almost the outsider who has threatened the position of the king, and therefore, just like a plain criminal, he is to be murdered or executed. Then we move on to Malcolm, who gives information on this execution which has been committed and the way in which the Thane of Cawdor was killed. Moreover, there is also a clear indication by the king that it's difficult to understand what a person means and what a person actually says. Duncan says, for example, there is no art to find the mind's construction in the face. He was a gentleman on whom I had built an absolute trust. These lines not only refer to the Thane of Cawdor's treachery and Duncan's final understanding of it, but it also emphasizes Duncan's lack of understanding of future rebels in his kingdom, namely Macbeth, on whom Duncan will similarly build a trust, whom Duncan will similarly consider a gentleman, but who will finally rebel against him. Then there is the important entry of Macbeth and Banquo, who have already been given much information about their present and future through the witches, and they enter into Duncan's palace, where Duncan proclaims his eldest son, Malcolm, the Prince of Cumberland, who will become the future King of Scotland. It's important to note Macbeth's formal response to the king's proclamation, where he says, I'll be myself the harbinger and make joyful the hearing of my wife. With your reproach, so humbly take my leave. He appears very happy. He appears someone who is elated with the news and will himself go to his own castle at Inverness and welcome the king there with the new proclamation that the king has made. However, immediately it is followed by an aside. It's important to remember that there's a small technical difference between a soliloquy and an aside. When we are witnessing a play on a stage and a soliloquy is uttered by the protagonist, the spotlight is on the character, while the other characters are present on stage, but there is no light on them. And since the spotlight is on the character who is speaking the soliloquy, he or she can be seen by the audience, and therefore the soliloquy is a conversation between the actor and the audience, almost like a personal conversation between them, which is unknown to all other actors on the stage. An aside is where the spotlight is on the actor at a certain located in a certain corner of the stage, but the other actors on stage are aware of him. In fact, the actor himself who is speaking the aside is aware of the position of the other actors, and he is very consciously hiding from them. Therefore, the primary difference between a soliloquy and aside is that in a soliloquy, the character speaking the soliloquy is sure that the other actors on stage or the other characters on stage are not involved in the conversation, whereas in an aside, there is a conscious hiding on the part of the character who is speaking the aside from the other characters or actors. And Macbeth, in this aside, which is the first of the important self-utterances by the protagonist of this play, says, "The Prince of Cumberland, that is the step on which I must fall down, or else overleap, for in my way it lies." It's very important that when Macbeth sees that the first of his desires, that his desire of becoming a king is falling apart, he decides on two steps. First, he feels that he has been defeated, the fall down, or the second step that he undertakes is overleap. This word overleap is very important because it refers to one of the important themes of Elizabethan England, which is that referred to in Harry Levin's book, The Overreacher. This book is on Marlowe. However, Harry Levin is here talking about an important theme of Elizabethan England tragic protagonists, which the tragic protagonists deal in. That is, they overleap or overreach or over-transcend their given boundaries, and to a certain extent commit a number of follies and errors which ultimately lead to their downfall. It's also important to remember that in this speech, Macbeth is relating one of the themes to which I referred to at the beginning, the relationship between the macrocosm and the microcosm. He's saying, "Stars, hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires." He's saying, he's here speaking to the stars, he's here speaking to the cosmos. He, as an individual, has committed a certain act, and he is able to relate that act to the larger forces of nature. Shakespeare is hinting, therefore, that whatever will happen in the life of Macbeth in the future will ultimately affect the whole of nature. There will, however, also come a point when nature will revolt against him and he will finally be defeated. For example, when later in the play in Act 5, in Act 4 and 5, there will be a forest which is not moving according to his understanding, and it is a signal or a sign for his defeat. There is also a conflict between what the eye sees and what the hand does. This fragmentation within the very self of Macbeth, within the body parts which all belong to him, but they are now working according to their own desires. It's the beginning of the self-fragmentation in Macbeth, which Shakespeare demonstrates in a very organic through an organic way through this body metaphor. Next, we move on to scene 5 in the castle of Macbeth, the Inverness Castle, which the scene begins with Lady Macbeth, who is reading a letter sent by her husband. This is the first time in which we are introduced to this character, and it's important that we are introduced to her through a letter which she is reading sent by her husband. Through this, Shakespeare is indicating that everything in the life of Lady Macbeth will be influenced by what her husband says or does. Therefore, from the very beginning, it's important to understand that this husband and wife share an extremely close and intimate relationship, and the action of one very closely influences the action of the other. And whatever Lady Macbeth does later on, the way she makes Macbeth understand his desires, his temptations, we are not to see those actions as manipulations, as manipulations on the part of Lady Macbeth, but more as the love of a wife for her husband, who wants her husband to reach the topmost of the heights, albeit in a way which is not morally correct and which is not ethically very sound. To come back to the letter then, she reads, "They met me in the day of success, and I have learnt by the perfectest report they have more in them than mortal knowledge. When I burned in desire to question them further, they made themselves air, into which they vanished. Whilst I stood wrapped in the wonder of it, came missives from the king, who all hailed me Thane of Cawdor, by which title before these fair sisters saluted me, and referred me to the coming on of time, with Hail, King that shalt be. This have I thought good to deliver thee, my dearest partner of greatness, that thou mightest not lose the dues of rejoicing by being ignorant of what greatness is promised thee. Lay it to thy heart, and farewell." Here, in this letter, Macbeth gives voice to 2 or 3 ideas which have already been implanted within him, and therefore it is important not to blame Lady Macbeth for these ideas in Macbeth further on. The first is, Macbeth is talking about burning in desire. Second, he is talking about being hailed as the king, as an idea or as an occasion for rejoicing. And finally, he is referring to Lady Macbeth as his partner in greatness. Macbeth feels that he has already been promised greatness, and therefore he shall duly achieve it, and he makes his wife a partner of this whole action. Therefore, any further influence by Lady Macbeth on the actions of her husband is something which has been duly asked for by her husband, and not something which she does solely on her own desire or solely to fulfill her own desire. Lady Macbeth's response to this is, "Glamis thou art, and Cawdor thou shalt be. What thou art promised, yet do I fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. Art not without ambition, but without the illness should attend it." These lines, that Macbeth's nature is too kind or too full of the milk of human kindness, and that it does not have illness, these lines have often been quoted to say that these are ideas which Lady Macbeth implants in her husband later on. But we should move further into the speech to understand why she does these things. That wouldst thou holily, wouldst not play false, and yet would strongly win what thou'st have. She is saying, she further says, that I hie thee hither, that I may pour my spirits in thine ear, and chastise with the valour of my tongue all that impedes thee from the golden round, which fate and metaphysical aid does seem to have crowned withal. She is here saying that she would pour her spirits into her husband's self and chastise her with the valour of her tongue. It's important to note that whatever Lady Macbeth is saying to her husband, or the mode or the process through which she wishes to influence her husband, is through communication, is through talking, and is through verbal deliberation. It's not something which is psychologically situated within the self of Macbeth and therefore psychologically transmutes him. Of course, it's important to acknowledge that Lady Macbeth is an important external influence in the desires of Macbeth, but she is not someone because of whom these desires originate. And it's also important to note that the amount of influence that Lady Macbeth casts on her husband also has a counter reaction on her own self, which we will witness, or the beginnings of which we will witness a little later. Just after this, there's a short passage where the condition or the atmosphere of the Inverness Castle is described. It's described by Lady Macbeth. The raven himself is hoarse that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan. Under my battlements, come you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe topful of direst cruelty. Make thick my blood, stop up the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctious visitings of nature shake my fell purpose. It's important that here Lady Macbeth is not only describing the atmospheric condition of the Inverness Castle, which is gradually darkening, indicating the darkness which will befall the life and the future of Duncan, who will come here and finally be murdered, but it is also indicating that the decision which Lady Macbeth had taken to verbally influence her husband requires a lot on her part, and therefore she hails the spirits to unsex her, which means that as a woman there was also something of kindness and extreme care on her which belonged to her, which needed to be uprooted from her very self. She was someone who was extremely kind, and she needed to be turned into a person who was cruel. She was a person who had a lot of mercy within her, but this guilt, and when she would commit a murder, there would be guilt in her, but she says that external spirit should come and remove this guilt from within her, so that she is not deflected from her aim of guiding her husband to that position of utmost greatness. It's important that if a person was cruel and a person without any lack of remorse from the very beginning, then that person wouldn't require external spirits to come and change her nature, to change herself. Therefore, in the process of influencing Macbeth, Lady Macbeth also finally influences herself. When Macbeth reaches Inverness Castle, before King Duncan, Banquo and the rest of the courtiers reach there is a long section in which he is seen interacting with his wife, and these conversations between them are an important beginning of the desire and the downfall of Macbeth. Lady Macbeth, in the speech where she says, "To beguile the time, look like the time, bear welcome in your eye, your hand, your tongue, look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." He is here teaching Macbeth the craft of an equivocating appearance, that he should appear calm, he should appear happy, but underneath he should plot the killing of the person whom he is here inviting into his castle. It's important that this dramatic irony of appearance and this dramatic irony of verbal communication is something which was already implanted in Macbeth to a certain extent, when he had hailed Malcolm as the Prince of Cumberland, had appeared happy, but within himself he wasn't extremely joyful on listening to the news. There is also in the next scene, scene 6, where Macbeth, which is located in Macbeth's castle, where he is seen, where Duncan, Malcolm, Donalbain, Banquo, Macduff, Ross and Angus, all of them enter, and they are talking about the extremely pleasant atmosphere of the Inverness Castle, which is presided over by the warm summer breeze. And it's almost as if the center of goodness and nurturance and the pleasant and the most pastoral and pristine aspects of nature. And Lady Macbeth is entering, and Duncan is hailing the mistress of the castle as the reigning queen of this pastoral Arcadia. And Lady Macbeth herself demonstrates that dramatic irony of appearance and that dramatic irony of verbal communication where she says, all our service in every point twice done and then done double were poor and single business to contend against those honors deep. She's here saying, how do we understand that here she is enacting that dramatic irony of appearance and verbal communication? Because she's exaggerating, and this exaggeration works in two ways. There is an inflation, every point twice done and then done double, so it's like 2 into 2 into 2. And then there is a deflation, were poor and single business to contend. So all of this centers becomes just one, so it's 2 into 2 into 2 becoming finally just one. And this process of inflation and deflation is something which Lady Macbeth here demonstrates, which is an indication that Macbeth is learning something from, or that Macbeth should be learning something from his wife here. And then it's also important to note that Duncan himself does not understand this, and therefore all the more heightening that the future that lies in wait here, or the further days that lies in wait here at Inverness Castle, is going to be enacted in just that way, that it's going to be that he's going to be heaped a lot of praise, that he's going to be heaped with a lot of dignity, but ultimately it will become null and void, that he will be murdered. In scene 7, Macbeth's castle, there is the beginning of the first of the soliloquies in this play. It's the first soliloquy, and of course it's the most important soliloquy in this play, where we get a close insight into not only whatever Macbeth is saying, but also into whatever Macbeth is feeling, and thirdly, into whatever is there deep within himself, about which he is not himself conscious at all. So there is the conscious level of the utterance, there is the subconscious level of the utterance, but there is also, importantly, the unconscious level of the utterance. Macbeth says, if it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could travel up the consequence and catch with his Cersei's success, that this blow might be the be-all and the end-all here. So he's saying that if the murder is committed, it is better that the murder is committed quickly. What are the three levels of the utterance here that we were talking about? The conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious. As far as the conscious level of the utterance is concerned, it's about Macbeth desiring to kill the king. The subconscious level is the indication of doubt in being able to commit the whole act. He's saying if it were done, that if the murder at all could be committed. And the third or the unconscious level of the utterance is that there is a deep-rooted consciousness, or there is a deep-rooted guilt in Macbeth, which will surface once he has committed this act. He doesn't know that this guilt at all will resurface or surface at all, because he doesn't even wish to discuss this guilt, and therefore he's saying, why do I say that it's a thought which is there in his unconscious self, about which he himself doesn't know, because he's saying that it's better to do the deed quickly, so that this guilt does not surface at all. So there is a slight inkling in his self that a guilt could retaliate, so may as well just gloss over it, so that I can say that it didn't even exist. And then, of course, he relates this whole process within himself to the way in which time moves, the be-all and the end-all of here, and upon the bank and shoal of time we jump the life to come. Moving on, he says that he establishes this very close relationship to Duncan. Again, this conscious loyalty on the part of the kinsman who had served his king for a long period of time, and the relationship which Duncan and Macbeth here shares is almost like the relationship between the father of the kingdom and the kinsmen, who are just like his sons. The kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed, and then as the host who should guard against the murderer, who should against his murderer shut the door and not bear the knife myself. So he's saying that both as a kinsman, as a son, as a host, he shouldn't murder Duncan. And moreover, the goodness of Duncan and the meekness and the gentle and the kind nature of Duncan is here emphasized, which is important to consider and cross-refer with the amount of kindness or the milk of human kindness which Macbeth himself has. And therefore here it's almost one kind person saying that the other is so kind, therefore he shouldn't be murdered. And there is also pity in Duncan, which if murdered will be like murdering a newborn child, where this act of the murder of the child will almost be a criminal act as far as this life and the next life is concerned, because you are not murdering a person, you are almost murdering the origin of life itself. And therefore, it's important to remember that the metaphors that Macbeth is using in this soliloquy are all related to his own self, which he is here almost seeing in Duncan, and which are about to be murdered or destroyed or annihilated because someone's desires and someone's temptations are at a rise. It's important that all of these qualities would also be found in Macbeth, and even they would be destroyed and annihilated gradually as Macbeth becomes not the brave king or the great king, but a most villainous king towards the latter section of the play. The soliloquy ends with what will actually happen if the same thing which is to be committed to Duncan would also happen to him, because it's important to understand that soliloquies not only reveal about the present of the character who is speaking the soliloquy, the present of course in various levels of existence, the conscious, the subconscious and the unconscious, but also about the future of the character. So soliloquies are extremely predictable about the future, and this last metaphor is about what will happen in the tragic future of Macbeth. He's saying, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition. This word vaulting is to be related to the word overleap or overreach, which is a characteristic word of the Elizabethan England tragic protagonist. But only vaulting ambition, which overleaps itself and falls on the other. So Macbeth realizes that this ambition of killing Duncan is not just a pure ambition, but it's a vaulting ambition. It's something which is rising and something which is almost going out of bounds, out of control, and anything which goes out of control or out of the given bound can only result in destruction and not any kind of greatness. You begin with pure ambition, but finally you end in not justified ambition, but of course hardcore villainy. After this, there are short speeches both on the part of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, where they are talking about the influence of one over the other. And Lady Macbeth says, was the hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself, had it slept since, and wakes it now to look so green and pale? And she almost taunts Macbeth as being the poor cat in the adage. And Macbeth retaliates, I dare do all that may become a man. Who dares do more is none. Here the relationship between manhood or the larger idea of gender is associated with bravery. It's important to take into account this metaphor in terms of a gender relationship, because Lady Macbeth was previously talking about unsexing her. So from a woman, she always wants to become a man to do something hideous. Here Macbeth is saying that whatever a man does is something kind, is something merciful, and therefore if you have to do something hideous, then you should be more than a man that is almost like a monster. And therefore Shakespeare does not really conform to the gender stereotyping that a woman is weak and that a man is brave. He is saying that anyone who commits something hideous, something against nature like murder, is unnatural, even if she is a woman or a man. And the next speech where Lady Macbeth says, "What beast was it then that made you break this enterprise to me?" Here Lady Macbeth correctly identifies that someone who commits action and any action against nature, even though she uses this word unconsciously, she says that it's not a man, not a woman, but almost a beast who is here trying to commit something unnatural. And then she says, and these lines are very important, where she says, "I have given suck and know how tender it is to love the babe that milks me. I would, whilst it was smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out, had I so sworn as you have done to this." Here Lady Macbeth is saying that if a person decides to become beastly, if a person decides to become unnatural, then a person can do the most cruel of the act, because he has sworn himself, because he has sworn his whole body, his whole soul to the act. Therefore, if these lines represent a cruelty in the figure of Lady Macbeth, who is it's almost like a mother being extremely cruel to her child, dashing its brains out. It's important that Lady Macbeth has associated the whole of this behavior to the beastly self of the human. Shakespeare is here not saying that the normal womanly self is something which commits this cruel act. It's a human being who, in the process of achieving his ambitions, has almost become like a monster, almost like a beast, and therefore does something which is extremely cruel. And it's also important to remember that unlike the fickleness of Macbeth, unlike a Macbeth who always changes his mind and seeks the help of someone to deal the cards while he is the winner, Lady Macbeth is extremely strong and committed to the cause of doing something, even if that is unnatural, even if that is something which is destroying almost her father, like almost the relationship which she shares with Duncan, or a father-daughter relationship, because she's committed to this cause. We see her commitment here. And she says, "We fail, but screw your courage to the sticking place and we'll not fail." And then she plots out the whole of the action of the murder of Macbeth, the murder of King Duncan. And Macbeth's response here is very important to take note of. He says, "Bring forth men children only, for thy undaunted metal should compose nothing but males." Here, of course, it's important to understand that we are to take Macbeth's statement not as the voice of Shakespeare, who says that anyone who is able to contemplate murder in a very calm and logistical manner should give birth to only male children, or that manhood is associated with the calm planning of murder. It's important to note that here Lady Macbeth has already unsexed herself. Here Macbeth has already turned into a beast, and they are both here plotting the murder, and therefore manhood, Shakespeare does not associate manhood or womanhood for that matter with the calm planning of murder, but a monstrous and an unsexed nature with the calm and the cool plotting of murder. And the act ends with Macbeth's speech, "I am settled," and bend up each corporeal agent to this terrible feat away and mock the time with fairest show. False face must hide what the false heart doth know. It's important that the speech ends with not only the commitment of Macbeth to the cause, which he has learned from his wife, but also with the final imbibing of that dramatic irony of verbal communication and facial expression, through which he will hide in his heart whatever he wishes to commit, and therefore he'll be able to mock time. It's important that Shakespeare also here says that one of the challenges which will be presented to Macbeth will not only be in the human form of Macduff or Malcolm and Donalbain, but also time. If Macbeth has begun to mock time, there will come a time when time itself will mock Macbeth.